Modern Russian Orthodox lay writers have spent much time struggling with the issue of what constitutes a proper Orthodox Christian civic community life in a hostile world. They have produced an incredibly rich reflection on that issue, from Dostoevsky to Solzhenitsyn, and including many other authors in both literature and philosophy. Our speaker is, I believe, the best-known Orthodox Christian author in public American political culture today, grappling with how to be a faithful Christian and live in community in our increasingly secular republic. A senior editor at the American Conservative magazine, Rod Dreher grew up in St. Francisville, Louisiana, a town that he has made famous in his writings. Partly through his reflections on life in that Southern American small town, he has been able to explore larger universal issues of how to be an Orthodox Christian in modern American society and what the horizon may be for a post-secular age to come. His most recent book, The Benedict Option, has gained worldwide interest for taking that focus deeper into exploring how we should live our lives and raise our families and deepen our parish communities in the face of a Western public square increasingly hostile to Orthodox Christians and traditional worship communities generally. In addition, his daily reflections online have made him one of America's most eminent cultural and political columnists, whose work is followed by people of many backgrounds and is a must-read also for even those who may vehemently disagree with him. Welcoming Rod, whose saint's name is Benedict, to this conference at Holy Trinity Orthodox Seminary and Monastery seems particularly appropriate given his interest in monastic-related Christian community. We see the history of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia all around us here in the portraits and icons in this hall. We can remember the monastic hierarchs and scholarly clergy who wrote on orthodoxy here, such as Archbishop Averki, and those who visited, such as Father Seraphim Rose, and their legacy. We see the image here of Tsar Martyr Nicholas, a model of Christian witness whose intercession we ask today in our endeavors going forth from this conference. If the Rokor was known in earlier times for preserving traditional Russian Orthodoxy in exile in the face of communism, it must be seen today as integral to the effort to evangelize and save the post-Christian suffering people of the West in the middle of a cultural revolution that is the focus of our speaker's current work. Without further ado, it's a joy to introduce Rod Dreher.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, but I have to say, before I start my speech, how surprised I was to come to Jordanville and to hear Father Chad Hatfield recommend the book Submission by the author Michel Houellebecq. I think it's absolutely a vitally important book. Houellebecq is one of our most important writers. He's a French novelist. He's difficult to read, but he's not a Christian by any stretch. His books can be kind of raunchy in parts, but he is the only major novelist today who is writing about what happens when God dies, what happens to a society after the death of God. His books are incredibly helpful in diagnosing the illness. And the reason I want to tell you a short story about him. When I was in France a couple of years ago when the Benedict Option was translated into French, I went over there to give some speeches and have some meetings. I ended up having coffee one day with a man who is one of the leading public intellectuals in France. I don't feel comfortable giving his name because it was a private conversation, but he agreed to meet me through a mutual friend. And the thing we talked about, even though he's a secular man and an atheist, the thing we talked about was Michel Houellebecq. And we agreed that Houellebecq is a prophet. And Houellebecq sees the weaknesses in France today and in the West more generally. We talked about Houellebecq, we talked about Islam in France, we talked about the fact that secularism in France is going nowhere. It's nothing but disintegration. So I listened to this intellectual, and finally I said to him, even though I agreed with everything he had to say, and I said, "So where do you find your hope?" And he looked at me very thoughtfully and said, "I have no hope." And this is one of the most intelligent men in France. I have no hope. I told him, I was very startled by that, and I said, well, I do have hope. My hope is in Jesus Christ, but I'm not telling that to you as sort of shallow American TV evangelist type. I'm saying to you, I know that we are going to suffer disintegration, and I believe, I said to him, that we Christians are going to suffer persecution. But my hope is not the same thing as optimism. Christian hope is the assurance that no matter what we suffer, God is with us. Our Lord suffered too, and that our suffering our suffering has meaning, and it's redemptive. This is the sort of thing I said to him, though I was stammering, trying to basically witness to this famous French intellectual. He listened very politely, then he looked at me and said, "Well, that's very good for you Americans, but here in France, we can't believe any of that. We believe that this world is all that there is, and when you die, you're dead." I didn't know what to say to him after that, but I've been haunted by that conversation. So what he was talking about is the problem of transcendence. He believes, as a matter of intellectual conviction, and most of France is like this today, that there is no transcendent realm. Funnily enough, in the book Submission, at the center of the novel is whether or not there is a transcendent realm. The protagonist, Francois, he's lost in his life. He's an alcoholic. He's an academic. He's an alcoholic. He has lots of affairs, and he knows his life is not going anywhere. He goes on a pilgrimage at one point to a Marian shrine, a medieval shrine where people would go pray to the Theotokos. And while he's there, he has a mystical experience. And you sense that he is on the verge of conversion. But at the last moment, he says, it must have been something I ate. And he returns to Paris and converts to Islam, because Islam in this future France is rising. He converts not because he believes in Islam. He converts because it's easy. It'll make his life easy if he does that. I had to reflect as well, and I talked to this intellectual about this. My own conversion to Christianity as an adult began in France when I was 17 years old and knew everything there was to know about everything in life, and I knew that God didn't exist, and this religion I'd been raised in was probably not true. My mom won a trip to Europe in a church raffle, didn't want to go, so she sent me. I was the only young person on this tour bus full of elderly Americans. But you can imagine how that was like. But I didn't care. I wanted to go to Paris and go to all the Hemingway haunts and go to the art museums. As the coach was driving towards Paris, we stopped at an old town about an hour outside the city to go look at an old church. And I almost didn't get off the bus because I didn't want to follow around a bunch of elderly Americans around another old church. But I did get off anyway, and thank God for it, because this was the cathedral at Chartres, one of the greatest example of Gothic architecture of the High Middle Ages. And I entered that church, and there was nothing in my life in being raised as in a small town America in the late 20th century that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in the stones and the glass and the ceiling vaults of that medieval cathedral. I did not walk out of there as a Christian, but I walked out of there changed, because somehow I knew that God existed. And not only did God exist, but he wanted me. So I left that cathedral on a search that eventually ended up with my conversion as a Roman Catholic in my early to mid-20s. And I became Orthodox 13 years ago. I won't go into that story here, but I think it's important because it took an encounter with beauty, with beauty created by men whose names we don't even know today, who were inspired to build that cathedral out of a love for God and a love for the Mother of God. In fact, the cathedral, many people don't know this, but it's dedicated to the Mother of God. And that has stayed with me over the years as I have reflected on how it wasn't argumentation that pierced my defenses. It was beauty. It was God speaking through beauty. And Michel Houellebecq, I commend him to you if you have something of a strong stomach, but he is a prophet. Pray for his conversion. But he is, when you read Houellebecq, you become aware, or I became aware, that beauty will save the world. Beauty in the sense of being a revelation, a theophany, a revelation of the transcendent realm that calls people to it. I I suggested to that professor that I talked to, the French intellectual, that he go to Chartres and see for himself what happens to him. We ourselves, though, in our own daily lives, I think we have to do our very best when we're raising our own children and in our own parishes and our own lives to help people be aware of the realm of transcendence, something as basic as that, something that even pagans have long believed to be true. I think we must be the only people in the history of humanity who had to be convinced that there is no God and there is no world of the Spirit. I believe it was C.S. Lewis who said that it would be easier to evangelize a pagan people than it is to evangelize Western people today who believe that this world is all there is. But anyway, that's a nice lead into this speech because I'm going to talk about the embodied faith and the importance of that. Since my book, The Benedict Option, was published 2 years ago next week, in fact, I've given countless talks about it. The book has now been translated into 9 languages, and I've delivered a number of addresses about it to Christians in Europe. Believe it or not, it's easier to talk about the decline and fall of Christianity in the West when you're among European Christians as opposed to American Christians. European believers have lived through several generations of de-Christianization. They are not deceived, European Christians today, they're not deceived about the depth and the breadth of the current crisis of our civilization. American Christians, they often have to be convinced of it. But this is the first time I've had the chance to talk about the Benedict Option and Orthodoxy. Though I am an Orthodox Christian, I wrote my book for a general audience of what I call small o Orthodox Christians, the term that I use to describe morally and theologically conservative Christians. The truth is, I believe that for reasons I will get into today, that Orthodox Christianity is by far the best suited of all Christian confessions to endure this crisis, and not simply because Orthodoxy is theologically true. Orthodoxy is anthropologically true in particular ways. I don't say that as an apologist for Orthodoxy. I say that as someone who has read about how men hold on to their faith in a time of dissolution and disintegration. We Orthodox have been given an incredible gift passed down through the centuries. As Bishop Rene said, we Orthodox have the antidote to the sickness of this age, and of any age. We offer deliverance to the besieged Christians of the West. I'm going to explain this, but first let me share with you, for those who haven't read the book, my diagnosis of the crisis of our civilization and why I believe that the monastic model, the monasticism, offers all of us living in the world a way through it. These are not normal times. We in the West are in the worst crisis since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. We don't see this collapse clearly because it's hidden by our wealth and our technological advance. But make no mistake, the fundamental pillars of Western civilization are crumbling, and none more severely than the institutions of the church. Our crisis is actually a combination of crises. First, it is a crisis of meaning. In the West, we have arrived at a place where many people no longer believe that meaning exists at all and that we can know meaning. They don't believe in a transcendent realm. The modern historian Yuval Noah Harari says that the world today can be explained by a simple transaction. People have exchanged meaning for power. That is, to gain the right to do whatever we desire with our bodies and with nature, we surrender the idea that objective meaning exists. We're free to do as we like, but the cost of that freedom is nihilism and disintegration. It is also a crisis of truth. We have lost the ability to determine what is true and what is false. We can no longer agree on a narrative. I'm saying we as a culture. We can no longer agree on a narrative that allows us to reason together. And this is one reason, perhaps the reason, why we find it so difficult to resolve our conflicts. It is also a crisis of fragmentation. In our time, people have lost a sense of unity and of purpose. We no longer feel that we're part of a wider community connected by the bonds of family and the bonds of citizenship, the bonds of brotherhood. Radical individualism is the new normal. The old bonds of family and community and so forth have mostly dissolved. It is finally a crisis of identity. We have cut ourselves off from God, from our past, from family, from our places, and from any of the traditional sources of the self. We don't know who we are as a people. Today, in the name of freedom, we even deny our biology as males and females. All of these crises are manifestations of what one critic has called liquid modernity. This critic, the late Marxist sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, says that the modern condition is one in which everything changes so quickly that it becomes impossible to find stability. The one who thrives in liquid modernity is one who has no relationships and no commitments, nothing to tie him down. Modern man is not a pilgrim, that is, a man who goes on a meaningful journey with others towards a certain destination, but rather he's a tourist who travels wherever his whims and desires take him. This is nothing new. In his famous 6th century rule, St. Benedict of Nursia identified this kind of person as a gyrovague and called him, quote, the worst kind of monk. He goes from monastery to monastery without stability, taking what he can and then moving on. A gyrovague is lost. The rule of St. Benedict is a way of life that offers everything the gyrovague refuses. It trains communities that live by the rule to discover meaning, truth, real community, wholeness, and identity. The rule is a source of life and hope for a dark and confused world, precisely because Benedict wrote it out of his own experience of the collapse of Roman civilization. As a young Christian, he fled from the city of Rome and went to live and pray in a cave in Subiaco, and eventually emerged to found monasteries and to write his rule. When he died in the year 547, and remember, of course, the church was one then, when he died in the year 547, there were only a few Benedictine monasteries. But over the next centuries, the movement grew. Historians credit the Benedictine monks for laying the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in the West later in the Middle Ages. How did they do it? Benedict was a Christian who sought a way to serve God in community amid a world in which all certainties and all moral structures had collapsed. The early Benedictine monks did not seek to save civilization. They did not set out to make Rome great again. They only wanted to put the search for God first and to order everything else from that. The search for God first and order everything else from that. To find God, they established a way of life that consecrated everything to his service. Prayer, work, study, worship, eating, living together, all of it was ordered by the rule to keep the members of the community constantly on an inner, orderly pilgrimage to unity with God. Theirs was a life of constant conversion. The fruits of that conversion were shared throughout Western Europe over the next centuries. Now, the monks did not only stay inside their monasteries, but rather they became a blessing to all the people around them. They taught them how to pray, most of all, but they also taught the peasants how to cultivate gardens, how to build things, and how to do all kinds of ordinary things that people forgot after Rome's collapse. And within the monastery libraries, the monks preserved the cultural memory of Greco-Roman civilization. Well, I believe that today, we Christians who live in the world have a lot to learn from the rule of St. Benedict and the historical example of those monks and nuns. What I call the Benedict option is the choice all Christians must make if we want to hold on to our faith in this age of darkness, this age of disintegration. Christians today have to understand ourselves as exiles and develop ways of living that keep the faith alive through this long trial that the church is enduring. Now, the most common misconception of the Benedict option is that it is a call to head for the hills and to build fortresses. This is not true. There is no real escape from modernity any more than there was high ground to escape to in the Great Flood. Besides, unless we have been called to the actual monastery, We have to live in the world. I think that we should understand ourselves, we lay Christians, as being like the Hebrews in their Babylonian exile. Through the prophet Jeremiah, the Lord told his people that he allowed them to be carried into exile for his own purposes. It won't last forever, he said, but until such time as I deliver you, you should settle in Babylon, raise families, and pray for the peace of the city. I think that we have to take that seriously, but we have to understand that in light of the first chapters of the book of Daniel. There we see the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrews who were the king's servants. You can hardly be more assimilated into the structure of Babylonian society than to be servants of the king. But when the king demanded that those men bow down before a graven idol, they chose the prospect of death, a terrible death, a martyrdom, over sacrilege. Today, we Christians have to ask ourselves, how did these three holy young Hebrew men live there in Babylon such that when they were put to the test, they chose death before abandoning God? Whatever they did, we have to do as well in our own Babylonian exile. The term Benedict Option comes from a famous passage by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue. In the book, MacIntyre says that the disintegration of the West has reached a decisive point, a breaking point. He compares it to the collapse of the ancient Roman imperial order. Today, he said, there are those who have ceased to identify the moral life with the maintenance of the contemporary social order. He calls it the imperium. Instead, not always recognizing what they were doing, they choose to instead to devote themselves to creating new forms of community within which the moral life can be continued in this new dark age. He writes that we await another and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. What he's saying is we have to look to the Benedictines, the founding generation of Benedictines, and think about what kind of moral order, what kind of communities, small communities, can we build today so we can keep our traditions alive. MacIntyre was not a Christian when he wrote this, but he was on to something. He subsequently converted to Catholicism. MacIntyre's point for us Christians, as I interpret it, is that we face a decision. We can continue to labor to build up this failing post-Christian order and try to assimilate to it, or we can opt to focus primarily on building communities within which our faith can survive this cultural revolution, which keeps getting worse and worse, more intense and more intense, and which will come, it's trying to come for our children and will come for us someday. Let me be clear again, we lay Christians are not monks. We are called to live in the world to support our families. But if we're going to live faithfully in the world, then we have to spend far more time and effort away from that world, in prayer, in study, in fasting, and in doing other things to root the faith deep in our hearts. Our spirituality has to become more disciplined and, yes, more monastic. Because our calling is to live in the world, we must always offer the gospel in word and in deed to that world. The Great Commission is still valid for us and binding on us. But today, so many of us Christians are weak in faith, and we cannot give to the world what we do not have. I mentioned that it's hard to convince many American Christians about how perilous our situation is. Well, nobody who has examined the literature, the academic literature on Christian belief and practice can possibly be optimistic about this situation. And I remind you that hope is not the same thing as optimism, but the signs are pretty dire. The faith has been declining over the past few generations. That's normal, we know this, but with millennials, it has walked right off a cliff. Among those who still profess belief in Christianity, what they actually believe in is a pale imitation of the historic faith. The sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, calls this pseudo-Christianity moralistic therapeutic deism. It's what happens when the bourgeois spirit casts out the Holy Spirit and parasitically inhabits the language and traditions and institutions of Christianity. Moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD, teaches that God exists, but the only thing he wants from us is that we're happy and satisfied with ourselves and fulfilled and nice to others. Hell exists, but really the only people in there are Hitler and his friends. And we only really need to call on God when we need something. Otherwise, we can get on with our lives. It renders God the Father as sort of a cosmic butler. Whatever this is, it's not Christianity. MTD is the de facto religion not only of American teenagers, but also of American adults. I'm 52 years old. I was raised in the 70s by parents who didn't often go to church. We knew when we were conservatives, and we knew we were on the right side. But the religion we had was MTD, just a conservative version of it. And I see that all the time today. To a remarkable degree, teenagers today have adopted the religious attitudes of their parents. I certainly did as a teenager. We have been an MTD nation for some time now, though that has been disguised by the presence of churches everywhere and by a lot of talk in the public square about Christianity. Christian Smith told me in an interview I did with him for the Benedict Option book, quote, "America has lived a long time off its thin Christian veneer, partly necessitated by the Cold War. That is all finally being stripped away by the combination of mass consumer capitalism and liberal individualism." We Orthodox Christians can't really look down on Catholics and Protestants. We are also failing to impress upon our people and our children what it means to be faithful Orthodox Christians. This is a particular tragedy because unique among all the Christian traditions in the West today, or in the world today, Orthodoxy has retained the pre-modern vision that was once universal to all Christians before the advent in the late Middle Ages of modernity in the West. This is not the place to go into the philosophical details, but I can say that only in Orthodoxy does one find in the ordinary life of the Church the incarnation of that earlier vision. Put simply, in pre-modern Western Christianity, according to the philosopher Charles Taylor, there were three basic bulwarks upholding everybody's vision of the world, the Christian vision of the world. First, they believed that the world and everything in it was part of a harmonious whole, ordered by God and filled with meaning. All things that exist are signs that point to God. Second, all social relations are grounded in that higher transcendent reality. And third, the world itself, the material world, is charged with spiritual force. It would not be accurate to say that this doesn't exist in Roman Catholicism today, but as someone who has spent half his Christian life, as an adult Christian life as a Roman Catholic, I can say that actual existing Catholicism in the United States, in most places, has lost this vision and has almost entirely absorbed the flattened, disenchanted, modern vision. Catholic life, liturgically and otherwise, has become bland, moralistic, and mechanical. I should say that it does not have to be that way. When I taught the Catholic audiences, I tell them that you have in your own tradition resources to lift you out of this flattened, consumerist, materialist mentality, but you got to look for it because in many cases the church itself, the Catholic Church itself, is not going to give this to you, and you're going to tick off your priest if you go looking for it. But whatever their theological errors, again, Catholicism still retains immense resources with which to resist this disintegration and desacralization of our age. But again, since the 1960s, ordinary Catholics have to work very hard to find them. I can't really talk to the situation among evangelical Protestants because I've never been part of that world, but I'm sure they have their own version of the same thing. In this talk, though, I don't want to compare and contrast theological teaching between East and West. Instead, what I want to do is focus on how the practical, ordinary life of living orthodoxy fits what anthropologists say is necessary for traditions to thrive in modernity. When I first encountered orthodoxy 13 years ago as a very broken Roman Catholic, my first thought was, this is what I thought Catholicism would be when I converted back in the 1990s. Now, this was before I knew much of anything about Orthodox theology. This was what I learned by worshiping liturgically with the Orthodox in St. Seraphim Cathedral in Dallas. This is what I learned from discovering the Jesus prayer and the role of asceticism and different practices within the daily life of Orthodox Christians. Years later, as I was writing the Benedict Option, I discovered in anthropological text why some version of monastic practices, that ordered life, are necessary for lay Christian life today when all the structures are in flux and have collapsed. I also discovered why Orthodox Christianity is uniquely suited for the Benedict Option. Now, Paul Connerton is a social anthropologist at Cambridge University. I don't know anything about him personally, but I can tell from his writing that he's almost certainly some sort of Marxist. Yet he wrote a brilliant little book called How Societies Remember, in which he examined small traditionalist societies to discover how they managed to hold on to their traditions in liquid modernity, which dissolves everything it touches. Again, he wasn't going at this as a religious person, and the societies he examined as an anthropologist weren't all religious societies. Just get that out of the way now. In modernity, and this is his definition of modernity, the individual conceives of himself as wholly self-determined. By contrast, traditional societies believe that the individual's identity is determined in part by things external to himself, by religion, by other people in the society, by his relationship with the past, and so forth. Our experience of the present, says Connerton, largely depends upon our knowledge of the past. The struggle of traditional societies in the modern world is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The more radical a social order's aspirations, the more it will try to control the memories of the people within it. A people that has been cut off from its past, whether they have been denied access to those memories, as happened under communism, or whether they have chosen to be indifferent to the past, that's a people that can be dominated. In the case of the church, those who make the Christian life only about good works or only about the individual's personal relationship with personal experience of God surrender to outside domination and disintegration, whether they know it or not. The anthropologist Mary Douglas has said that when a religion turns away from its mystical, cosmological teachings and begins to focus mostly on the individual's personal piety, it's on the way to decline. Notice she's not saying that we shouldn't be personally pious, not at all. She's saying that when that becomes the main focus of a religion, the religion is in a decadent period. Then, when the religion turns to what we today call the social gospel, doing good works as being the whole of the religion, which is what a lot of liberal Christians believe, that religion has gone terminal. It all begins, though, with losing a palpable sense of the sacred, rooted in historic community. For his part, Paul Connerton finds that no culture can exist without shared memories, that is, traditions. So how do small traditional cultures that manage to hold on to their shared memories in the face of modern disintegration, how do they do it? He found that they have several things in common. First, these communities have a sacred story that tells them who they are. Second, these communities commemorate their sacred stories more or less by having ritual performances. These performances have to do specific things, Connerton says. They have to tell the sacred story in the same way, repeatedly. It must be understood by the community, all who are gathered for this rite, that this sacred rite, in some sense, takes its participants out of ordinary time and puts them in touch with the eternal, and connects them, and also connects them to past generations within the community. And third, this ritual telling of the sacred story must involve the body. The sacred story, in Connerton's lovely phrase, must be, quote, sedimented into the bones. In this way, the sacred story and all that it implies, the cosmic order that it embodies, must become a matter of what Connerton calls habit memory. Now, Orthodox Christians, does this not sound familiar? Reading Connerton for the first time, I understood from an anthropological point of view why orthodoxy was and is so powerful. The beauty and the power of the divine liturgy with its chants, with its candles, with its prostrations, icons, and its conscious, intentional evocation of eternity is an unparalleled bulwark against the disintegrating forces of liquid modernity. But the divine liturgy is not magic. As the anthropologist Mary Douglas has written, a culture's rituals express its cosmology, its idea of how the sacred order, of how order is constructed. And in so doing, it constructs its sense of reality, the culture's sense of reality. But that cosmology must be lived and realized outside the ritual. If we live as if there's a separation of religion and life, like we go to church on Sunday, but the rest of the time we're living in another world, then we rob the liturgy and the religion of its transformative power. Attending the divine liturgy is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The liturgy must be part of submitting to what Douglas, the anthropologist, calls, quote, a total pattern of symbols. That means, put in more common language, you have to live it. You can't just leave religion, you can't leave orthodoxy behind at church on Sunday and holy days. It has to be there from the time you wake up in the morning to when you go to bed at night. I have to speak concretely here. If we are to sediment the Christian faith into our bones, then we must constantly submit the body to the purification of the spiritual life and practice. We have to pray. We have to pray with our bodies, crossing ourselves, making prostrations, kissing icons. These things are not empty gestures at all, or rituals without meaning. These seemingly minor gestures are among the most meaningful things we can do because it sediments the faith into our bodies. I've noticed, maybe you've had this experience too, that when I go into any church, my first Protestant church or Catholic, my first impulse is to make the sign of the cross because I'm just in that habit. I took my children, my family is Methodist, my extended family in Louisiana. I took my children to my niece's confirmation when she was 13 a few years ago, and that was the first time my two younger children had ever been inside a Protestant church. They walked in and said, "Where are the icons?" And it was a kind of a cute thing, but to me it taught a deeper lesson that for them, God is everywhere. If you understand who God is, you know that he is everywhere, and he is present, everywhere present, filling all things. And Christian asceticism, which is only practiced in any serious way today by Orthodox Christianity, is absolutely necessary. Again, I don't want to get into the theological reasons here, but from an anthropological point of view, ritual asceticism, fasting in particular, sediments into our bones the reality of our religion's cosmology. We Orthodox know that fasting disciplines the body and brings it into greater harmony with God. It is necessary to theosis. Before I became Orthodox, I thought of fasting as a kind of punishment. I did not realize that fasting is necessary for our ultimate healing. If I can be personal for a moment, I want to talk about how sexual asceticism worked for my own inner healing. I came to Christ as an adult, as I said earlier, through Roman Catholicism. As a single man, aged 25, living in the big city, Washington, D.C., I found that giving up my sexual freedom was the only serious sacrifice I had to make. But it was a big one for me, because there was nothing in contemporary culture to support my struggle, and frankly, very little in the culture of contemporary Catholicism. Nevertheless, I knew well the Egypt from which I had come in search of Christ, and I was not going to go back there. I lived in the desert, so to speak, for 3 years, not knowing if God had in mind for me to marry. And of all people in this world, Courier Frederica Matthews Green, who is one of my dearest and oldest friends, she knows exactly the desert I was living in because I complained to her all the time about, where is God? Will I ever find a wife? This is so hard. I only knew, though, that I had to obey the Lord. Eventually, I met the woman that I would marry, and the meaning of my 3 years of ascetic chastity became clear. Through my ascetic obedience, the Holy Spirit healed the brokenness within me and prepared me for marriage. Had I not allowed the Lord to reorder my erotic desires through ascetic obedience, I would not have been able to marry. I'm convinced of that. And I would not have been able to sustain this marriage of 21 years through difficult times. We all know that sexuality is the most divisive issue in contemporary Christianity. Mainline Protestantism has abandoned the prohibition against homosexuality. Many younger evangelicals are rejecting the teaching about homosexuality and heterosexuality. And within Catholicism, under Pope Francis, homosexuality is fast becoming normalized. Even in Orthodoxy, there are academics and clerics who are trying to change the Church's teaching to conform to the spirit of this age. This is not a minor thing. This is not one of those things that we can be in dialogue about. From a Christian anthropological point of view, this is an existential crisis. Is sex the linchpin of the Christian cultural order? Is it really the case that the cast-off Christian teaching on sex and sexuality is to remove the factor that gives or gave Christianity its power as a social force? Though he might not have put it quite that way, the eminent sociologist Philip Rieff would probably have said yes. Rieff's landmark 1966 book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic analyzes what he calls the deconversion of the West from Christianity. And Rieff was not a believer, he was a secular Jew, but he saw very deeply into the role of religion in secular society. Nearly everyone recognizes that the process of deconversion has been underway since at least the Enlightenment, but Rieff showed that it had reached a more advanced stage than most people, least of all Christians, recognized. Again, he's writing in the 1960s. He identified the sexual revolution as a leading indicator of Christianity's demise. In classical Christian culture, Rieff wrote, the rejection of sexual individualism was very near to the center of the symbolic order that has not held. He meant that renouncing sexual autonomy and sensuality of pagan culture and redirecting the erotic instinct was intrinsic to what it meant to be a Christian. Without Christianity, the West was reverting to its pagan state. The point is not that Christianity was only or even primarily about redefining and revaluing sexuality, but that within a Christian anthropology, for reasons we heard about earlier today, sex takes on a new and different meaning, one that mandated a radical change of behavior and cultural norms. In Christianity, what a person does with their sexuality cannot be separated from what a man is. In a sense, moderns believe the same thing, but from a perspective entirely different from that of the early church. In speaking of how men and women of the early Christian era saw their bodies, the historian Peter Brown says that the body, quote, was embedded in a cosmic matrix in ways that made its perception of itself profoundly unlike our own. Ultimately, sex was not the expression of inner needs lodged in the isolated body. Instead, it was seen as the pulsing through the body of the same energies that kept the stars alive. Whether this pulse of energy came from benevolent gods or from malevolent demons, as many radical Christians believed, sex could never be seen as a thing for the isolated human body alone, close quote. Early Christianity's sexual teaching, which we still preserve in the Orthodox Church today, does not only come from the words of Christ and the Apostle Paul. More broadly, it emerges from the Bible's anthropology. The human being bears the image of God, however tarnished by sin, and is the pinnacle of an order created and imbued with meaning by God. In that order, man has a purpose. He is meant for something, to achieve certain ends. When Paul warned the Christians of Corinth that having sex with a prostitute meant that they were joining Jesus Christ to that prostitute, he was not speaking metaphorically. Because we belong to Jesus Christ as a unity of body, mind, and soul, how we use the body and the mind sexually is a very big deal. Evangelical Christianity and Magisterial Catholicism both say the same thing, but only within Orthodox Christianity is the reality of the unity of body and soul made manifest in everyday devotional practice. I'm not saying that Orthodox Christians are necessarily holier than the non-Orthodox, not at all. What I am saying, though, is that within Orthodoxy, we can more fully appreciate the meaning of the Incarnation, and only Orthodoxy gives believers today the means to sediment the meaning of Christianity within our bones. Orthodox Christianity is the most radically countercultural form of Christianity in the modern world. This is not a bug, this is a feature. It's not easy to be faithfully Orthodox in America today, thank God. In her well-known 1970 book, Natural Symbols, the anthropologist Mary Douglas, whom I've quoted a couple of times, she was an English Catholic, lamented the English Catholic bishops' abandonment of the Friday fasting requirement in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Instead, the bishops encouraged the faithful to do works of charity on Fridays. In their statement, the bishops said that this would make it easier for Catholics in England to assimilate to modern English life. The Friday fasting rule, the bishops wrote, caused other English people to regard Catholics as odd. So they ended the practice. Mary Douglas wrote with sadness and even a tinge of bitterness, quote, "Now there is no cause for others to regard us as odd. Friday no longer rings the great cosmic symbols of expiation and atonement. It is not symbolic at all, but a practical day for the organization of charity. Now the English Catholics are like everyone else." Close quote. Let us American Orthodox not be like everyone else. Let us insist on our difference. To make the faith acceptable to post-Christian America is to kill it. We have to keep it mystical. We have to keep it embodied. We have to keep it countercultural, and we have to keep it traditional. I'll end with a quote from Pope Benedict XVI, a man I quite admire. He once said that the best arguments for the Christian faith are not syllogisms and apologetics. Rather, he said, the best arguments for the faith are the saints the church produces and the beauty that comes from the church. We Orthodox understand that very well. Encountering the beauty of the liturgy and the iconography and the chants, as well as entering into the lives of the saints all around us, the saints who live among us in our icons and in our prayers and thoughts and in the stories we tell, all of these are doorways leading to the truth, who is Jesus Christ. Beauty and goodness made incarnate lead people to a life-changing encounter with the Lord. I know that because this happened to me. Bishop Rene was right. We Orthodox do have the answer to what man longs for. We return him to his body, and modern man to his body, and we return his body to the Lord. We immerse modern man in beauty and goodness, if we're doing it right. We help him know who he is and who he can become in Jesus Christ, and we teach him how to sediment the truth into his bones. What else is there? Seriously, what else is there in this world but Orthodox Christianity? Has anybody in this room ever encountered a form of Christianity more powerful than Orthodoxy? If not, then we have a story to tell the world. We have a story to tell our countrymen. We have to use words if necessary, but show them with the lives we lead, with the churches we build, with our iconography, what it means to be alive in Jesus Christ. Thank you so much. And I have time for a few questions.